George Herbert Walker Bush and Barbara Pierce were married for 73 years, longer than any president and first lady in American history. And when people talk about their marriage now, they usually reach for the same word: storybook. That is the word George himself used more than once in interviews given late in his life, and it is the word that ended up on magazine covers, in eulogies, and in the kind of retrospective television segments that run after a former president dies. What almost none of that coverage mentioned, because almost none of it was allowed to be mentioned while both of them were alive, was that Barbara Bush spent 6 months in the middle of the 1970s pulling her car over on the side of the road because she was afraid of what she might do with it, that she carried a documented, 20-year rumor about her husband and another woman through 3 separate presidential campaigns without once breaking in public, and that the woman most Americans remember as the smiling grandmother in fake pearls used her own private diaries, kept for decades and handed over only in the final 6 months of her life, to finally let a journalist see what that smile had actually been covering. This account is built from her own 1994 memoir, from the biography she personally cooperated with before she died, from contemporaneous news reporting going back to the 1980s, and from customs filings and campaign records most retrospectives never bother to pull. Only one other woman in American history, Abigail Adams, was ever both the wife of a president and the mother of one, and Barbara Bush spent decades keenly aware that whatever she chose to say, or not say, about her own marriage would eventually become part of that same historical record. If long marriages that were not actually simple are the kind of story you come back for, the subscribe button is sitting right there, and there is a lot more of the Bush family still to get into. Barbara Pierce was born on June 8, 1925, in New York City, the third of 4 children belonging to Marvin Pierce, an executive who eventually ran the McCall Corporation, publisher of McCall's and Redbook magazines, and Pauline Robinson Pierce, who chaired the Conservation Committee of the Garden Club of America, and was, by nearly every account left behind by people who knew the family, a strikingly beautiful and strikingly critical woman. The Pierces raised their children in Rye, New York, a comfortable commuter town on the Long Island Sound, and by Barbara's own later description, comfort did not translate into warmth. Pauline openly favored Barbara's older sister, the one considered the pretty one, and she fixated on Barbara's weight in a way that stayed with her daughter for the rest of her life. Barbara would later joke about being heavy or plain constantly, a kind of self-deprecating humor that became almost a signature of hers once she reached the White House, but people close to her understood the joke had a source, and the source was a mother who criticized far more often than she praised. Barbara wrote in her own memoir that decades later, when advisors on her husband's 1980 presidential campaign quietly discussed whether she should lose weight or change her style to look more like a modern candidate's wife, the conversation reopened the exact wound her mother had left, and she said she simply shrugged it off in public while it devastated her privately. She was sent to Ashley Hall, a boarding school in Charleston, South Carolina, where she served on student council and acted in school plays, the kind of upbringing meant to prepare a certain type of young woman for a certain type of marriage. It did not prepare her for losing her own mother young. In September of 1949, while Barbara was pregnant with her second child, her parents were in a car accident that killed Pauline instantly. Because of the pregnancy, doctors advised Barbara not to travel from California for the funeral, and she did not go, a decision she referred to for the rest of her life as one of her deepest regrets. Decades later, when a journalist writing her biography asked what she would have titled the book herself, Barbara did not hesitate. She said she would have called it "The Fat Lady Sings Again," a joke that traced straight back to a mother who never let her forget her weight, delivered with the same defensive humor she had been using to survive that kind of criticism since she was a child. If any of this sounds familiar, if you grew up with a parent who noticed the flaws faster than the wins, you already know what that kind of childhood quietly teaches a person about swallowing pain instead of naming it, and if that is part of your own story, the comment section below is a fine place to say so. Barbara met George Herbert Walker Bush in December of 1941 at a Christmas dance in Greenwich, Connecticut, while she was home from Ashley Hall on winter break. She was 16, he was 17, a senior at Phillips Academy in Andover, home for the same holiday. A mutual friend introduced them, they danced, and when a waltz came on that neither of them knew, they sat it out together and talked for 15 minutes instead, which both of them later described as the moment they decided they liked each other. Barbara went home and told her mother she had met the nicest boy at the dance. George wrote to his own mother that he had met the niftiest girl in the room. Pearl Harbor had been bombed only days earlier, and the war that followed compressed everything about their courtship into letters, because George had already decided he would enlist the moment he finished school. He graduated Andover in June of 1942 and joined the Navy at 18, training as a pilot. For the next 2 years, while Barbara attended Smith College in Massachusetts, the two of them wrote to each other across oceans. And George, flying torpedo bombers in the Pacific with Torpedo Squadron 51 off the carrier USS San Jacinto, named 3 separate aircraft after her: Barbara, Barbara II, and Barbara III. They became secretly engaged during a Navy leave in the summer of 1943, with the engagement made public in the newspaper that December. On September 2, 1944, Bush's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a bombing run against a Japanese radio tower on the island of Chichijima. His 2 crewmates were killed. Bush completed the bombing run anyway, bailed out over open water, and floated alone for roughly 4 hours before the submarine USS Finback pulled him out of the sea, an event that later earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. He came home on leave that December. The couple spent Christmas Eve together at the Pierce family home in Rye, and on January 6, 1945, with the war in the Pacific still unfinished, they were married at the First Presbyterian Church in Rye. Barbara was 19. Because so many men their age were still overseas, she remembered the reception at the Appowamis Club afterward as, in her own words, mostly a party of women. She would say for decades that she married the first man she ever kissed. Within 8 months, George had left active duty, and the newlyweds moved to New Haven so he could enroll at Yale on the GI Bill, the first of what would eventually total 29 different homes over the course of their marriage. After George finished Yale in 2.5 years, a pace made possible by summer classes and sheer determination, he turned down a comfortable position waiting for him at his own father's investment firm and moved the family to Texas instead, first to Odessa and then to Midland, to build a career in the oil business from nothing. Barbara followed him through Odessa, Midland, briefly California, and back to Texas again, raising a growing number of children largely alone for long stretches while George worked, traveled, sold equipment, and slowly built the company that would eventually make the Bush family wealthy. Their first child, George Walker Bush, was born in New Haven in July of 1946. 4 more children followed over the next decade: John Ellis, known as Jeb, then Neil, then Marvin, then Dorothy, known as Doro. Barbara later wrote that she counted 29 separate moves across the span of their marriage, a number that ran from small rental houses in the oil patch all the way to the vice president's residence and eventually the White House itself. And she often described those early Texas years with a single word: lonely, because George's work regularly pulled him away for days at a stretch, while she managed a growing household by herself in towns where she knew almost no one. By the standards of the era, it was an entirely conventional arrangement. Barbara had grown up expecting to marry well and manage a household, and for roughly the first 2 decades of their marriage, that is largely what she did: cooking, driving carpools, teaching Sunday school, running the kind of domestic operation that made it possible for her husband to build both a business and, later, a political career. She rarely complained about any of it publicly, then or afterward, and she would eventually write in her own memoir that she belonged to a generation of women raised to believe a wife's ambitions were supposed to run through her husband's, never alongside them. That belief would be tested in ways she could not have predicted while the family was still young and the moving trucks were still coming one after another. Barbara's turn toward public advocacy did not begin in Washington, and it did not begin for political reasons either. Her son Neil struggled badly with dyslexia as a boy, undiagnosed for years in an era when the condition was barely understood outside of specialists, and watching him fight to read gave Barbara the cause that would eventually define her as First Lady: family literacy, a subject she cared about long before it became useful to her husband's campaigns. Susan Page, who spent hours interviewing Barbara in the final months of her life, later described the marriage itself as one that changed shape gradually across 7 decades, moving from what Page called a traditional arrangement in which George simply called the shots towards something closer to an actual partnership by the time the two of them reached their 80s, sharing a couch most evenings while he read the newspapers and she read novels, correcting each other's memories of stories they had each told 100 times before. In the spring of 1953, Barbara noticed that 3-year-old Pauline Robinson Bush, the daughter born 3 months after Pauline Pierce's death and named for her, had become unusually listless and pale. Barbara took her, known in the family as Robin, to to their pediatrician, Dr. Dorothy Wyville, who drew blood and asked Barbara to return that afternoon with George. Wyville told them Robin had advanced leukemia, a diagnosis that in 1953 amounted to a death sentence for a small child, and she advised the Bushes to take Robin home, keep her comfortable, and let her go without further treatment, telling them she likely had 2 weeks left. George and Barbara refused to accept that. Through a family connection, they found doctors willing to treat childhood leukemia at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, an institution barely equipped for the disease at the time, and moved Robin there for aggressive treatment involving repeated bone marrow tests and blood transfusions that, by modern standards, would be considered brutal for a child that young. Robin lived another 7 months. Barbara stayed with her in New York for most of that stretch, while George shuttled back and forth from the oil business in Texas, and on October 11, 1953, Barbara was in the room combing Robin's hair and holding her hand when her daughter died, 2 months short of her 4th birthday. In the weeks that followed, Barbara later wrote in her 1994 memoir, "What wounded her most was how completely everyone around her avoided the subject, as though a 3-year-old who had lived and been loved had somehow never existed," writing plainly that she hated that nobody mentioned her. Barbara said she fell apart for roughly 6 months, and she credited George specifically with holding the family together through it, a debt she referenced for the rest of her life. It was during that period that people close to the family began noticing Barbara's hair turning white, a change tied by nearly everyone who knew her to the strain of losing Robin. She was 28 years old, she never dyed it back, and the white hair that later became one of the most recognizable features of any American First Lady began, quite literally, as a visible record of grief she chose not to hide, even while she hid almost everything else about how that year actually felt. George, for his part, wrote her a letter about Robin years afterward that the family only made public after Barbara's own death in 2018, telling her that Robin was still with them, that they could not touch her but could still feel her, and that he hoped she would stay in their house for a long time. It remains one of the few surviving pieces of writing in which George Bush let anyone see, on paper, exactly how much that loss had cost him too. Robin's death was not the only stretch in which Barbara Bush came close to a despair she almost never discussed publicly. In 1976, President Gerald Ford appointed George Bush director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a job that required him to keep nearly everything about his work secret from his own wife for the first time in their marriage, arriving at the exact moment their youngest children were leaving home, and Barbara's daily role as a mother, the identity that had organized her entire adult life, was disappearing along with them. What followed was a depression severe enough that Barbara later told her biographer, journalist Susan Page, that she thought seriously about ending her life. She described a recurring impulse to steer her car into a tree or into oncoming traffic, and said that more than once she pulled over to the side of the road and waited, alone, for the impulse to pass, because she did not trust herself to keep driving. In her 1994 memoir, written years before she ever spoke to Page, she put it plainly, admitting she felt ashamed and hid the depression from her closest friends, telling only George, who would come home from a punishing schedule at Langley, to find her in tears and hold her while she tried to explain what she was feeling, night after night. She wrote that she wondered during that period why he did not simply leave her. She never saw a therapist, largely because women of her generation and class were not raised to see therapy as an option, and the depression lifted on its own after roughly 6 months, helped, she said later, by volunteering at a hospice, a decision that let her sit with other people's grief instead of only her own. Susan Page's biography, published in 2019 with access to Barbara's private diaries, adds a detail Barbara herself never spelled out quite so directly in public. Around that same period, rumors had begun reaching Barbara about a woman on her husband's staff, a British-born aide named Jennifer Fitzgerald who had worked at George's side since his diplomatic posting in China 2 years earlier. Rumors that a source close to the family described to Page as involving whispered conversations and giggly phone calls. Page does not claim the rumors were confirmed, and nobody involved, then or in the decades that followed, ever admitted to an affair. What is documented is the timing. The depression that had Barbara Bush pulling her car over on the side of the road happened during the exact stretch of years when questions about her marriage first started circulating quietly through Washington, questions that would not become public for another 8 years and would not become a full national story for another 12 years after that. Jennifer Fitzgerald was born in England in 1932, came to the United States as a child, and by the early 1970s was working in Washington political circles when she first crossed paths with George Bush, then chairman of the Republican National Committee during the Watergate years. When Bush was appointed chief of the American Liaison Office in China in 1974, essentially the top American diplomat in Beijing, before the two countries held full relations, Fitzgerald left her position and went with him as his personal secretary, in a role Bush reportedly wanted her to fill as a buffer between his office and the State Department. When Bush came home to run the CIA in 1976, the same year Barbara's depression began, Fitzgerald came with him. When Bush became vice president under Ronald Reagan in 1981, Fitzgerald became his appointments secretary, controlling who got access to him for 8 straight years. When Bush finally won the presidency himself in 1989, Fitzgerald was made deputy chief of protocol at the State Department, a post that kept her inside his orbit while keeping her, notably, out of the White House itself, because according to multiple biographers, Barbara made clear she did not want Fitzgerald working there. For nearly 20 years, wherever George Bush's career went, Jennifer Fitzgerald went with it. The rumors that had trailed the two of them quietly since the 1970s first broke into public view in 1984, when a footnote in journalist Susan Trento's book about Washington lobbying The Powerhouse quoted a former American ambassador complaining that he had been asked to arrange adjoining hotel rooms for Fitzgerald and then Vice President Bush during arms control talks in Geneva. The story resurfaced hard during the 1988 campaign, when Republican strategist Lee Atwater grew so worried that Newsweek was preparing a major story on the affair that he chain-smoked through an entire lunch with 2 of the magazine's reporters without ever directly denying it. The actual denial came instead from George W. Bush, who called one of the reporters days later and told him flatly that the answer to what he called the Big A question was no. It resurfaced again, far more publicly, in August of 1992, during Bush's re-election campaign, when a CNN reporter named Mary Tillotson asked him about the affair rumors on camera, at a joint news conference in Kennebunkport, Maine, alongside Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Bush went stone-faced, then furious, calling the allegation a lie and saying he was outraged even to be asked. Barbara Bush was standing nearby the entire time, and reporters covering the event that day described her expression moving through stages, from confused to focused to disbelieving to something closer to disgust, though she said nothing publicly and never once contradicted her husband's denial, that day or any day after. Fitzgerald denied the affair as well, every time she was asked, for the rest of her career. What almost nobody reported at the time was what the accusation cost her personally. That same month, Fitzgerald's own mother told the New York Post that her daughter had confided she wanted to kill herself over being described in print as the president's mistress, and that she felt abandoned by Bush, who her mother believed had not defended her the way a man should defend a woman. No affair was ever proven. No one involved, across nearly 2 decades of rumor spanning 3 presidential campaigns, ever confirmed one on the record. What is documented in customs filings, campaign memos, contemporaneous news footage, and the private diaries of the woman standing beside him at that podium in Kennebunkport is that Barbara Bush carried an unresolved question about her own marriage in full public view for close to 20 years, and answered every version of that question the same way, every time, with total, practiced silence. The rumor produced one more small, telling episode 2 years before the Kennebunkport confrontation. In 1990, returning from an official trip to Argentina, Fitzgerald was caught by United States Customs underdeclaring the value of a fur-lined raincoat and failing entirely to declare a silver fox cape she had purchased abroad. She was fined $648 and given a 2-week unpaid suspension from the State Department, a punishment several colleagues at the time considered unusually light for that kind of violation, and more than one of them said privately they believed she avoided harsher discipline only because of who she worked for. It was a minor customs case on paper. In practice, it was one more data point feeding a rumor that had already outlived 4 separate stages of George Bush's career. Barbara's public loyalty to her husband did not soften with age, even as a different kind of accusation began surfacing in his final years. Starting in late 2017, several women independently came forward describing incidents in which an elderly George Bush, by then confined to a wheelchair and dealing with a form of Parkinsonism, had touched them inappropriately during photographs at public events, frequently preceded by a joke referencing a fictional magician he called David Copperfield. Actress Heather Lynn said Bush touched her from behind during a photo in 2014 while Barbara stood right beside him, and that Barbara rolled her eyes afterward in a way Lynn read as meaning, essentially, not again. Actress Jordana Grolnick described a similar incident at a theater in Maine, saying that when it happened, Barbara responded in the moment by joking that her husband was going to get himself put in jail. Novelist Christina Baker Klein described a nearly identical incident at a 2014 fundraiser for the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, a charity carrying Barbara's own name. A fourth account, reported through CNN, described an incident from 1992, while Bush was still sitting president, suggesting the pattern predated his old age and physical decline by decades. Bush's staff responded to the wave of allegations by pointing to his wheelchair and limited mobility, explaining that his arms simply fell at waist height when people stood close for photographs, and Bush himself issued a formal apology, framing the behavior as a poorly judged attempt at humor rather than any intent to cause distress. Barbara, who was present for at least some of these incidents and had reportedly watched the pattern repeat for years, never issued her own statement distancing herself from her husband or from his explanation for it. That silence stood in sharp contrast to how outspoken she was willing to be on almost every other subject once she felt it was safe to have an opinion. Her private diaries, made available to biographer Susan Page before her death, described Donald Trump in openly hostile terms, calling him greedy, selfish, and ugly, and she told Page directly that she blamed the stress of watching Trump attack her son Jeb during the 2016 primary for a heart attack she suffered that summer. In the final months of her life, she told Page she no longer considered herself a Republican at all, a fact her family did not release until after she had died. That same willingness to speak her mind surfaced years earlier in a long, cold rivalry with Nancy Reagan, which came to a head in January of 1993, when Reagan called into live television coverage of Bill Clinton's inauguration to publicly criticize how the Bush family had treated her. Barbara reluctantly took Reagan's call afterward and told her flatly that the remarks had hurt her badly and that she did not understand why Reagan had made them. She had shown that same directness more than a decade earlier still, breaking from her own husband's party during the 1980 campaign to say publicly that she believed abortion should remain a matter of personal choice, a position that embarrassed campaign strategists at the time and one she never fully walked back under pressure to do so. Barbara Bush, it turned out, disagreed with people loudly and often. She was, in other words, a woman entirely capable of sharp, specific, lasting judgment, one she wrote down for decades and eventually chose to hand to a journalist. She simply never once turned that same capacity for judgment on the one relationship where the stakes, for her personally, were highest. By the spring of 2018, both George and Barbara Bush were dealing with a combined list of failing health that included Parkinsonism, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, congestive heart failure, and the lingering effects of a heart valve replacement Barbara had undergone nearly a decade earlier. Their granddaughter Jenna Bush Hager told television audiences around this time that despite everything, her grandfather still told her grandmother he loved her every single night, using the nickname Barbie, a small nightly ritual that had apparently outlasted every scandal, every campaign, and every silence that came before it. On April 15, 2018, following a series of hospitalizations, Barbara's office announced that after consulting her family and her doctors, she had decided to stop seeking additional medical treatment and would instead focus on what the statement called comfort care. She died 2 days later on April 17 at 92, with George at her side. According to Susan Page, who spoke with Barbara extensively in the final 6 months of her life, the former First Lady was not especially afraid of dying. What worried her more, according to people close to her in those last weeks, was leaving her husband of 73 years behind. 2 days before she died, the two of them sat together in the den of their Houston home, an ordinary, quiet moment that people close to the family later pointed to as one of the last real conversations they shared. George's own statement after her death said the outpouring of love for Barbara was lifting the whole family up, and he added, with the same dry humor that had marked their marriage since that first dance in Greenwich, that he had always half-joked she was the most beloved woman in the world, and that he had a complex about that fact. George Bush lived another 8 months without her. On the night of November 30th, 2018, with his health failing fast after what his longtime friend and former Secretary of State James Baker described as 3 difficult days, Baker went to visit him at his home in Houston. Bush opened his eyes, looked at Baker, and asked where they were going. Baker told him they were going to heaven. Bush said that was exactly where he wanted to go. His son George W. Bush spoke to him by phone not long after, told him he had been a wonderful father, and said he loved him. George H.W. Bush's last words, spoken back to his son roughly 40 minutes before he died, were simple: "I love you too." He was buried beside Barbara and beside Robin, the daughter they had lost 65 years earlier, on the grounds of his presidential library in College Station, Texas, completing a family plot that had been separated by 6 decades and was, finally, whole again. What Barbara left behind, beyond the marriage itself, was the decision she made in her final months to hand her private diaries to a journalist and let some of what she had spent 73 years not saying finally get said. It does not erase the 6 months she spent afraid of her own car, or the 20 years she spent answering questions about her husband's fidelity with silence, or the childhood that taught her to absorb criticism instead of naming it. It simply means that at the very end, after 7 decades of practiced quiet, she was the one who finally chose to speak. If stories like this one, the one sitting underneath the official version everybody already thinks they know, are what keep you coming back, subscribe for the next one, because there is a lot more of this family, and a lot more marriages that looked simpler from the outside than they actually were, still to get through.